Professor Kevin Cleary is on the faculty of multiple institutions in the area, and a longtime leader in the operating room of the future projects, which I think are coming closer to fruition thanks to his work. In addition to being a longtime funded NIH researcher, he's the lead of engineering for our Pediatric Surgical Innovation Institute at Children's, the Sheikh Zayed Institute, and it's been my pleasure to collaborate with Kevin on several pieces of work over the years. You may have seen some of their work and their team's work featured recently. So again, very excited to have Kevin share his views on the future of minimally invasive interventions, which I think as a pediatric neurosurgeon, we want to come sooner. So thank you so much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
All right, great. Thank you, Dan. So I'm going to rely upon you guys to tell me what you can see and can't see, but right now, at least in presenter mode, I can see everything. So I assume you guys have a nice view of the first slide, future of minimally invasive intervention. So
looking good.
Yep, good. All right. So we're going to do this in kind of 3 parts today. And I think, Dan, we have an hour for the talk. We want to try to finish a little early, or we have an hour and some discussion, or what's our timing today?
Yeah, I think maybe if there's time to leave a few questions for, especially for the technical folks at the end, I think that would be really nice.
Okay, we'll do that then. So, you know, as a professor, I can talk forever. So anyway, but I'm going to do this in 3 parts. So I'm going to share this presentation, which actually gave a little bit back at Computer-Aided Radiology and Surgery in Tokyo, right when the pandemic was ending. We literally landed in Tokyo, had to get a visa to go there, you know, had to get tested for, COVID. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of our newer work, as Dan hinted, funded by ARPA-H on autonomous robotic surgery, and then end with a special issue of science robotics that has just come out, which really kind of puts things in context now. So it's really a very exciting time with the pace of change, and it can be very hard to keep up. But I wanted to give you guys some background. So again, we can take questions at the end, but if you want to shout out something during the presentation, I'm happy to do that as well. This can be a little informal. It's always hard with these kind of Zoom and remote talks because you really can't see your audience. So anyway, but what I'll talk about is a little bit of background, you know, for people maybe who haven't worked in the field of what we mean by minimally invasive interventions. I'll present a little bit of our work on MRI robotics for in-bore interventions, so being able to do things inside the bore of a magnet, mostly in pediatrics, and then a little bit about the future of minimally invasive interventions. So this will be the first part. So the idea of where we want to go is that in the future, the physicians will be able to plan the intervention, carry out the intervention with minimal trauma, and maybe just as importantly, verify the intervention before the patient is taken off the table. And the new technology developments will be an essential part of these interventions. And obviously, cooperation between clinical and scientific partners is critical. So here I said CARS conference, but of course I could plug in SDSC, you know, for people who are working in the field. I think the key is now that this is really dependent upon technology. And so all the technology advances, many of which have come from the consumer market, to me are now feeding into medicine, but the appropriate use of those technologies, I think, is still a little bit tricky and requires close cooperation. So again, what do we mean by minimally invasive interventions right here? You know, so a lot of times now we're looking at computer screens rather at the body directly, but the idea is surgical techniques that limit the size of incisions, lessen wound healing time, really enabled again by technology. So here's endovascular aneurysm repair, which is much less invasive. And sometimes we can use interventions for procedures either done by surgeons or a group called interventional radiologists that I also work with very closely. So here, though, is actually a non-invasive intervention. So is this where we're going? This is the use of HIFU, or high-intensity focused ultrasound, using MRI to plan, treat, and monitor. So this is completely non-invasive. So will we also have non-invasive interventions in the future? You know, we want to go from the old days where we slice them wide open to procedures now with minimal trauma. All right, so here's some of the technology components for minimally invasive interventions. So of course, we're going to talk about robotics. We're going to talk about what we need by navigation and tracking and image guidance, things like image fusion, AI and machine learning, and of course the user interface is important. Many user interfaces are too complex, and certainly in surgery, where the surgeon has a high cognitive workload for the procedure, you do not want a complex user interface. If we go back to the history of medical robotics, I guess this is now a 40-year history. The first one was a robot to drill for neurosurgery, it turns out. So Dr. Donahoe's profession in 1985. Intuitive Surgical, founded in 1995, the Da Vinci robot. And many people complained in the early days that Da Vinci knocked out the competition, which is a little bit true. But now, because Da Vinci has been so successful, there is a lot of appetite in the surgical field for robotics, and multiple companies selling robots. These are just a few examples we can talk about: the medical catheter system, spine assist, Mako surgery for knee and hip, Medtronic Hugo, which is a little bit of a Da Vinci leg platform. So I think there will be a robot in your future. If we look at classes of medical robotics, so we can have tele-operated, cooperative, pre-programmed. I think this is old. I don't think we call it master-slave now. I think we call it leader-follower or something like that too. But that's Da Vinci. So Da Vinci, in some sense, got approval because they said, look, the surgeon is still doing the procedure and the robot is only doing what the surgeon tells us. But Da Vinci did separate the robot from, the surgeon from the instruments with the robot, and maybe enable digital surgery. So you can imagine in the future, if we have Da Vinci-like robots where we have some sort of partial task autonomy, you might tell the robot, hey, go ahead and suture this line, and Da Vinci could do very well. You can also have cooperative robots, robotic system that works synergistically. Mako Robotics constrains the cutting plane. Or you can do pre-programmed. So there are robots that do task autonomously based on pre-programming. The CyberKnife for stereotactic radiosurgery, which basically directs a radiation beam and can compensate for movements in the lung as tumors move, and do that in real time. And I was actually at Georgetown 25 years ago when they introduced CyberKnife there. Okay. All right. So here's Da Vinci robot. I think people have seen this, and if you watch the procedure, the interesting part is you don't even have the surgeon here. The surgeon is sitting at a remote console, what happens to be in the room, but of course be elsewhere as well. With Da Vinci, it's also kind of nice now with the new Da Vinci, you can also telestrate on the monitor. So you could take a pen, and if a resident was learning to work the Da Vinci and the attending surgery was watching here, they could telestrate what to do. You could imagine in the long run, if we would allow teleoperation, when you got to the critical part, maybe you have an expert from somewhere in the world teleoperate in and say, hey, do this. So I think this opens up what Da Vinci, I think, really did, also introduces digital surgery. Okay. All right. So I'll keep going. If you can't hear me or see, let me know, but I assume everyone can. All right. And then we come to something called single port surgery. Da Vinci is laparoscopic surgery. We have multiple ports, but single port surgery, we have one larger port where we put everything through right here. And this, I think it stalled a little bit, but now Intuitive does have a single port device. You're a little bit limited in what access you can reach, and the fact that these arms have to come out and, kind of be able to move around the anatomy. But again, these are all based upon technology. And then finally, the cooperative robot systems like Makoplasty, where there are several others. And I think this is a good mode, where the machine will do something, but the physician will still be in charge. And one of the questions, essentially, as the robots become more and more ingrained, is what is the role of the surgeon? If the surgeon only supervises the robot, how does the surgeon learn the procedure, and how can the surgeon take over if the robot fails? So I think those are questions that will have to be asked going forward. And then finally, the CyberKnife, which this was a pre-programmed plan right here based upon segmentation of medical images to track a tumor and deliver radiation dose. The CyberKnife works because it doesn't physically touch the patient in that sense. So it's very hard if you have a robot that's touching the patient for it to deal with internal organ movement here. But in the CyberKnife case, they can do that because they don't touch the patient. Okay, so that's robotics. Let's talk a little bit about navigation for people who aren't familiar with the term. So, just like you navigate in the car and with Google Maps, navigation has become very popular in surgery. initially for things like spinal pedicle screws that we'll show next. But a navigation system will have three components: a computer, of course, for control and a display, a localizer, which is a device that can track instruments, and there's different types of tracking systems we can use, and software for image processing. So you can see now this is the 25-year history, which was something called the Stealth Station from Medtronic. And now just about every major company offers different navigation systems. That started from pedicle screw placement. So again, you can see this article from 1998. So I know when we look at literature nowadays, we like to look at the latest literature, but I think sometimes it's good to go back and see that these technologies have been around for a while. And now, of course, the challenge is how to apply them appropriately and in surgery. And then finally, different types of tracking. Most localizers are worked on something we called line of sight. This, again, is about a 20-year-old system that came out where you have very small sensor coils, small electromagnets, essentially, that you place inside instruments or things that you want to track inside the body, and you have an external magnetic field, and so you can track non-line of sight as well. So all of these are now commercially available. Many years ago, I think before open source software and before Slicer really took off, we had a project called the Image Guided Surgical Toolkit, which was an open source system to combine these things where you could make your own navigation system. And this was a collaboration with a small business, Kitware. We also did some work when I was at Georgetown with electromagnetically tracked lung biopsy. So here you can see a needle, which has a little magnetic coil at the sensor tip, so we can track it. Some donut fiducials on the body, something called a field generator, which is the box hovering over it right here, and of course some engineers in the room. So I think at one point these things will be commodities in the operating room, that the surgeon will have navigation, will have tracking, will probably have some sort of visualization, and maybe a robot as well. All right, let me grab a little water here, and then we'll talk about robotics. So I'm going to focus on MRI robotics because that's what we do now. Before I came to Children's 15 years ago, I really didn't work in the robotic space much. The MRI space much. But in the Children's Hospital, we have more MRI than CT. So we like to do things, and we'd love to be able to do interventions in the magnet. Of course, better for the patient, but better for the physician as well, who does these all the time and won't be exposed to radiation. So we have 4 systems under development: Arthrobot for the shoulder, Pain Relief Bot for the back pain. I used to call it Pain Bot, but then I realized that Pain Relief Bot was a better term. Bone Bot for long bone biopsy, and an intracerebral hemorrhage robot for the brain. So here we are at the hospital where Dan and I work, a 3-part mission right here. We're a 300-bed hospital. We got a nice view over the city right here. So you're welcome to come visit our research institute, which is on the top floor of the hospital. And because we're a teaching hospital, we're used to having people in the OR. So all our researchers have medical clearance and can easily go into the OR. This was how we set up the institute in 2010. There was a very large gift from United Arab Emirates. And until then, they always had a lot of biology research in the hospital. But this time they brought a lot of technology in there as well. So we have engineers and scientists. We have 3D printers right here where we can make things. All right, now we'll go on why you would want to do MRI-guided interventions. MRI is great for soft tissue. No radiation exposure, as we say. Other functionality, we saw HIFU, high-intensity focused ultrasound at the beginning, monitor of thermal treatments. However, MRI with a closed bore access can be very difficult. So here's our interventional radiologist reaching in to what we call the ISO center of the magnet, the middle where the imaging is best. I just joked with him that his arm was too short to reach in. That's why it was hard. But obviously, this is not ergonomic to work. So we want to enable real-time image guidance during interventions in MRI. There was an article about this from a 2008 journal. And this, of course, talks about the issues of working in MRI because of the very high static and switching magnetic fields. So you'll see, signs the magnet is always on. You can't bring your keys, your credit cards, anything into there. And so you have to use certain techniques to design systems that will work in MRI. So we started with shoulder arthrography. We built here what we call a 4 degree of freedom robot. So this robot could put a needle down the middle here and could position it over the shoulder in that circle anywhere and could orient it about any angle. You'll notice I got some orange earplugs in here, but it was low profile. So the idea is that these are devices that ride on the body. You put them on the body, you go ahead and get an image, you register where the robot is to the images, and you're able to guide a needle guide towards the body. Once the needle is oriented in the right way, you actually slide out of the body. And right now we push it in by hand to avoid FDA issues where to keep the doctor in charge, and we get a confirming image. So this was a 4 degree of freedom device. The system architecture is such with the robot and components in the MRI room, and in the control room, the physician looks at the images, plans a path, and has the robot orient towards that path. That was for the shoulder. We went on to low back pain. I joke this is from my better side here, where you have another 4 degree of freedom robot on the back. But this one, we've added this beaded chain transmission where you can actually drive these needles in real time. So the idea is you could be at the isocenter of the magnet, and you could drive down with these kind of handles in this box at the end, kind of like a fishing rod, and watch the needle in real time. So for pain diagnosis. So sometimes if you do injections for pain diagnosis, if it doesn't work, the question is, was that not the source of the pain? Or is the question you didn't get the needle in the right place? If you did that under MRI, you would know. So this is some of the architecture of this system. So modularity with a built-in imaging coil. Here's a little picture of the integrated imaging coil that was built by colleagues at Cincinnati Children's. And we actually did a cadaver torso study here. So there's a cadaver back underneath that. We got permission from the hospital and infection control, did this on a weekend. And as you can see from the next images, we were actually able to put needles down into the facet joint and into the epidural space. There is a little bit of artifact from the needles under MRI. Now we have some more MRI compatible needles that don't have quite as much artifact, but we could successfully drive needles. So we continued, and we got a little bit of money to work on a project for long bone biopsy. This is a little different. Instead of riding on the body, this robot would be fixed to the end of the table, and the leg would be fixed. And so this is for the long bone in the leg. A child may come in, and under CT, the image on the right, you don't see a lot of discrimination, but under MRI, you see more. And the child may have a limp, and you need to get a sample of the bone so you can do pathology and start your diagnosis. So this one is one we finally got FDA approval. We're just getting ready to roll this out in trial. We had done some phantom studies. We had some very nice graphics of showing how we could target in these phantom studies. We later actually did a cadaver study as well here, and hopefully next month we'll kick this off. So the pathway from first concept to actually approval in patients here has been about 6 years. So it can be a little long to get these in practice, but that's ultimately our goal. And finally, on MRI robotics, let me wrap up with intracerebral hemorrhage right here. So this is the idea with intracerebral hemorrhage. When you have a stroke, it's a surgical emergency. You go in, they typically extract under fluoro or CT. But if you could do it under MRI, again, you would have better soft tissue discrimination. So we had a project to build something called a concentric tube robot here that could be tele-operated. And on the next page, a concentric tube robot, you can think of like a straw that would go in through your burr hole. And in that, you would have a little inner tube that you show on the right that you would deploy, and you'd be able to rotate and suck out clot. So we built a user interface for that, and we've actually now done some sheep animal studies at Vanderbilt that I won't show here today, just in case anybody's eating their lunch right now. Okay, so that's the MRI robotics. So the last part, just to wrap up this first phase, is to talk a little bit about, again, future of minimally invasive intervention. So where is all this going? One is this, obviously surgery is more dependent upon technology. We start on the left with open surgery. We go to laparoscopic procedures. We go to robotic surgery on the right. And then to the bottom right, we now have single port surgery. In the bottom middle, we have something called NOTES, natural orifice transluminal endoscopic surgery, where we go through the natural orifices and no openings. And then on the left, for those old enough to remember, we have The Fantastic Voyage, which was a movie where we inject little microbots into the bloodstream and they come down and do it. But the point is that we're becoming more and more dependent upon technology. and that the surgeon nowadays cannot operate without the technology. So it's up to us as technologies to develop these that they will eventually be useful in surgery. And then our clinical partners, of course, like Dr. Donahoe, to advise us. So here's, back from 1994. So this is John Wickham right here, who was a pioneer in what they called keyhole surgery, minimally invasive surgery. So even then, in this article, almost 30 years ago, he's saying robotics will allow some procedures to be done automatically. We may not be quite there yet, right here. Virtual reality, miniature motors right here. So I think he was predicting the future. And then I think what you have to do in the future is you've got to integrate all the surgical information. And this is where the informatics and AI may come in. The clinicians have so much data, patient data, clinical assessment, planning. How do you bring all that to the point of care of the surgeon so they can carry out the procedure in a precise and repeatable manner? And what role does the robot play in there? So there was a demonstration platform here with fully integrated clinical data. So, clinicians do have to integrate an enormous amount of information in their mind. And I think this is where AI may help as well. But of course, it will have to be validated. There was some work out of Germany in 2022 with a new flexible surgical platform. There's all kind of work on the surgical cockpit and what that will look like. So I think these things are all evolving, and then finally from the technology, we all know within our hand is that we have the, cell phone, and now we can get Chat GPT and other things on our phone. But, what do we do with all that information? So I think the consumer revolution is driving all this information. Okay, summary. So I do think medical robotics and image-guided navigation will be a part. Technologies will enable more precise surgery in a less invasive manner and could also improve the ergonomics of surgery, which I don't think surgery is that ergonomic. If you see parts of it, particularly have to wear lead. There's a little plug for a book that I edited some years ago. I think it's still there on Springer. And then finally, slide 2. And then this was a workshop we did in 2004, which I think is still relevant. So again, the future is integrating these technologies. As we said, give the surgeon all of the information, but we still need the surgeon to be in charge. As I tell Dr. Donahoe and our colleagues, we're not replacing you guys. We still need you in charge because you need to be in charge of patient care and need to advise us. But I think we need new user interfaces and methods for control and visualization. And finally, we need surgical teams that have test beds. So that's what we do at our institute, because we're physically in the top of the hospital and we seek funding for demonstration projects that can advance the field. And we collaborate with a lot of different, disciplines. So these are truly multidisciplinary right here. Of course, we would love to also look at whether such new technology and low-cost systems for the developing world, for example, based on ultrasound would be possible. But sometimes a lot of our technology can be expensive. So these are some of the acknowledgments and some of the funding sources that we have. There's some of my contact information. So let me see if I can get back to the first part. Okay, so that's kind of the first part. And then I want to give a little overview of the ARPA-H work. Should I take a question or two now, Dan, or should I plow through ARPA-H and the things then?
Yeah, I'd love to hear if folks have any big burning questions about how things work at Children's or the Innovation Institute, or how things go from idea to robot to maybe bedside someday.
Yep.
I'll ask one, Kevin, which is what if we're thinking about, a lot of this group is thinking about vision-based systems or AI for decision making as much as it is about effectors. What do you see as the major limitations on the effector systems that you've made so far, from either a decision-making or visualization standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question there. I think we've actually now been able to miniaturize things reasonably well. And as from also Richard Shaw, our faculty member who works with some of the different imaging modalities, there are new imaging modalities come out to see things. So to me, I think it still really is an integration question. How do we present this information, in a manner that you find useful? I think even, with your experience working with engineers, there can often be a disconnect between engineers and clinicians because, we live in different worlds. So for me, I think it really is a kind of the integrated view. I think while there are certainly individual technology developments, so there's so much technology developed, I almost feel like it's more adopting the technology to appropriate clinical use right now. I see Jack is up then.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I had a couple questions, so I'll just ask them both, and then you can decide how you answer them. The first one is how once these robots are like out in the wild, sort of linking it back to the data, what kind of feedback data do you gather after you start using these? And then my second question is, one of the things that we found at SDSC that's difficult is that multiple different surgeons or different institutions will do things in a different way. And I was wondering how you kind of like navigate that ambiguity and how you decide on which approach is the one you're going to go with for the robot.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the feedback question, Jack, are you asking what type of feedback is given to the surgeon, like force feedback, or what feedback you get from a system once it's put in on how to improve the system?
Mainly the second, yeah, like a data feedback question.
Right. So one, of course, is that with the data feedback, from a regulatory standpoint, once you put a system out there, it is somewhat locked down, and so if you want to make, substantial approvals, you're going to have to update your FDA approvals as well. So I think particularly with things like robotics, which are big and big, a lot of engineering goes into those. If you look even at the original Da Vinci versus now, I think what generation 5 they have, the basic principle and what we call the kinematics is still the same, and the quote, I guess, leader follower, as we call now, hasn't changed. So I do think, medicine can be a little slow to evolve that way because of regulatory issues. And, maybe that is safer, for the patient, of course. So now there is separate, I know that FDA, I can't remember the name, maybe people who know more of FDA, there is a new movement now, though, to gather what real world evidence, I think it's called, right, with FDA submissions, and whether that's more on devices that are used, for screening or in a less invasive way than surgical devices, and obviously FDA has their database too, where you're supposed to report incidents. But I'm not an expert in that field. So, I would deal to others. The other question about surgeons, and I kind of gave up getting surgical consensus right here. I worked previously for NASA Goddard, and I said that 30 years ago. I said that was very complex space, but we had mil specs, and it was very well characterized, and there wasn't a lot of variability. I think the thing about working in medical space is the variability is huge. Variability of how people's trained, variability of surgeons, variability of practice, variability of anatomy, and in pediatrics with the different sizes kids. So usually what we do is we look for a champion again. And I think Dan and others have been great in this respect, is I say, I don't need consensus because I don't think I'm going to get it. I look for a champion. Now, if that champion is so far out in left field, that you're kind of like, I talked to some other surgeons, and it's not just that they disagree, but they think this is insane. Is that bad? Maybe, probably not. I don't know. So that's really tough. But I would say, we look for a champion. I don't know, Dan, what are your thoughts? Do you think we can get surgical consensus about things? You may be muted still, Dan.
I think it's really hard. I think that there is nascent consensus around the kinds of, I would say this, the kinds of things that we're thinking about in like surgical process understanding and automation. Those are likely to be the things that you have consensus on, more likely than, let's say, a robotic workflow, which just has to work. It doesn't always have to work in the exact way that every surgeon would do it, but sort of everyone has to agree that it's an okay option. I think it's doable in the spaces that we're thinking about, but not in every space for sure. And in the less innovative spaces, it's of course easier.
All right, let's take maybe one more, and then I can kind of go on to the second point right here, second part. We have one more from the crowd. All right, I guess, Khan, you're up.
Yeah.
Saying it right.
Well, I just want to make, I have a question about, like, how does this, robotics and this innovation actually relate to the patient outcome and the recovery time? Like, do we have any data on that? And that might drive things to spread even more, or in a way that that can actually expedite things in this domain as well. Do we have any studies or anything that's going to be related to the patient outcomes and recovery times?
I will yield to Dan as well, but I would say that that is an exceedingly difficult thing to do. And I think, again, because of all the variability, and also the time frame it would take to gather that data. So I don't know. What are your thoughts there, Dan?
I think there's a lot less for automation, or such as it is, right, for robotic surgery, let's say. I think, what would I be comfortable going on record with? I would say there's less evidence of patient benefit than there are robotic procedures being performed commonly in the United States today.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, of course, we joke, I have a bad ankle on the left side and I had surgery. If I go to a surgeon, of course, they'll want to do surgery, and I think they're right and they're well-intentioned, but is that still the best for me or not? So, I think these are that stuff. Okay. All right. Are we okay then with going to the second presentation now, guys, then too? And let's see now if I can actually, get a window here that I can share. Okay, let's see. I'm getting better at Google Share at least now. All right, so this is the second one here. This may be a little more down your alley. Slideshow, play from start right here. Okay. All right, so this one, let's launch into this on semi-autonomous robotically assisted partial nephrectomy. This is a project that's funded by ARPA-H, with a lot of the technical work being done by our colleague Axel Krieger and his students at Hopkins, small place up there in Baltimore that we say. And I'm going to present this at the MIS week in Orlando in September right here. So just this is a disclaimer I put in for that talk. So I am on the board. Maybe I should have put that in here, but I don't give any financial compensation. So again, children's we talked about a little bit, so we can skip this one here for this one. So anyway, again, back to this conference, again, so of course there's a lot of new stuff out there, but many of the things that we have identified previous, now too as well, integration, interoperability, informatics, things like that, workflow. Dan, you mentioned even workflow, was mentioned. I think, again, just some of the new tools and techniques are making these things possible, including, of course, the electronic medical record right here. We're going to talk a little bit about surgical data science. So if you think this is a field right here, a new field. So an emerging scientific field with improving the quality of healthcare. And, so I think a little bit to Khan's question too, if we could also have post-op follow-up on things as well and collect that might help with outcomes right here. And then, of course, this evolution of surgery, which I talked to a little bit, but this diagram here, to me, just showing that things in some sense are also getting more complex. We have all this data that we want to integrate, but it's coming from different sources and may be very heterogeneous. So how do we do that? So I think one of the things we want to do as engineers is how do we take this complexity and make it simpler to give the clinician all this information. So I got a little plug for SDSC right here too as well. Okay. So this is the project. So this was called robotic renal tumor surgery. Was for 1 year, April 2024. I think I'm going to get the next year very shortly. I have the signed contract on one side. So let's hope right here. This was our team. So a group from Children's National. There you can see me and Kochai in the top. And then Axel from Hopkins. Axel was actually in our lab about 10 years ago. And then the group from ARPA-H right here. So the clinical background was kidney sparing partial nephrectomy is the standard of care. So you want to, of course, have good surgical margins because you don't want the tumor to come back, but you want to preserve as much healthy kidney as you can to have good postoperative renal function. And sometimes intraoperatively, it can be hard to tell what is tumor or not. So if we can give the surgeon assistance with that, we could help. Now let's see if this video will play and you guys can tell me if you see video. Okay, do you guys see video now?
Looks good.
Yeah,
yes.
good. Okay, so this is just kind of a very simple illustration of kind of automatically cutting in a very simple phantom model right here, but just some of the concepts right here. All right, let's go on here. Okay, this is the real case right here. So many of you may have seen some of these videos. Kochai, as we'll talk about later, has been working on video annotation here, but it is difficult to distinguish things intraoperatively. And if we can give some more help with that, where the robot then becomes your digital platform with image overlay into this, I think this could be useful. All right. So we developed a workflow, and this was actually Coach I's work here too as well, a partial nephrectomy with 8 steps. But we thought that there were 2 steps that were really key for what we wanted to do. One was using preoperative CT and a surgical resection plan, because that's what we want to then carry out in step 6, the tumor resection. And that really is the high value part of the procedure. So in most surgical procedures, to me, there's always a high value part. Of course, you know, you have to dissect, you have to get down to it. But this critical part is, how do you get all the tumor while preserving as much healthy tissue as possible? And that's what we want to help with. So we had a project schedule with 4 tasks: develop a workstation, robotic system develop, some phantom creation, and then adding a tumor model, and then a demonstration. And this was all done with one year. So a lot of this is now online, and we're looking forward to the next phase right here. So this was the video annotation framework that Coach I did, which I think will be pretty near and dear to your heart. And we certainly could have some discussion about the optimal way to annotate surgical video, if that exists right now. And surgery, we defined anatomy, we defined instruments, and then we define various phases. So here we see the 4 phases of approach, exposure, discectomy, and closure. So to me, this talks a little bit about surgical workflow that Dan mentioned in surgical data science. You know, and now up to now, you know, surgeons have done things by their training, but if we make it more scientific with phases and workflow and definition, and then annotated video, that could be an advance. So we use the Encore platform, where Coach I went in, mostly did this manually. We were able to use SAM 2 to annotate things a little bit. We got a little help with Rikai as well, too, who now works some at SDSC for this as well. Then this is just some of the slides from Hopkins. So this is the robotic side. So these are just phantom demonstrations now of this task. So, you know, we're making tumor phantom models. We're showing how we can take commercial robots and using them with cutting tools, how we can use computer vision, which becomes very important. And right now we're not dealing with respiration, you know, and so all these things would need to be solved in the long run. We did some work with image fusion and some of this occupancy cloud work. So if we have a 3D camera, how can we reconstruct the kidney and the tumor intraoperatively and then use that to go after things? And then also some of the control system right here. So how do we feed this back, you know, into the system? We have a planner. Right now, we're more working on preoperative imaging. Ultimately, we will marry with intraoperative imaging and surgical video annotation, potentially to drive the robot to do parts of the task in a real human model. And then here's some of the kidney phantom with the renal tumors right here that they're showing that they can go in, and how they actually make these phantoms from clinical cases too. So they're fairly realistic, and ultimately you could also perfuse these phantoms as well. And then finally, let me just see if one of these videos will play that shows the kidney phantoms. Yeah, this is how they image. And so now we're going in with some of the instruments here, trying to manipulate this based upon the automated robotic system here. Okay. And then finally, the demonstration task. So this was what I call an exophytic tumor. You can see the tumor from the outside in the middle. The close view video, I guess the second from the left, you see kind of tracing around. And then ultimately, we'll go in and we'll kind of scoop it out with a vacuum grasper. So kind of demonstration task right here. But this is just to start right here. So the summary of this project is autonomous robotic surgery was demonstrated on phantom models. Partial task autonomy may be possible in the future. Again, cooperation with clinical partners, and there'll be a surgical robot in your future. So that's it. So I think what I'd like to do is I want to just show, if I can manipulate my screen enough to do this for you guys. I want to show the science robotics stuff very briefly, and then we can open up to discussion. So we talked about the history of robotics and now moving towards autonomous procedures, and how we could take either preoperative planning or video from a surgical procedure that's animated, and then use that, annotated, and use that to control a robot. But let me just see if I can pull up the paper that Axel and his group worked, which is in Science Robotics. So if you look at the July 2025 issue of Science Robotics Online, there is a nice set of articles on surgical autonomy. And, you know, some of it is overhyped. The engineer will probably exaggerate a little bit right here too about where this is going, but it gives you an idea of where the field is going. And the field is moving very rapidly. You know, again, I would say the pace of change is much greater. I started in 86 with punch cards and no, 78. Fortran 77 in punch cards. So we've come a little bit now, and you know, and then, you know, we can talk a little bit about what we think about AI. Is AI, you know, the godsend that's going to cure this all? Is AI overhyped, or is AI some of both? AI is coming, and we should figure out what to do with it. All right, so let me see if I can share this article by Axel that that I think is worth reading. Let's go down to share screen again and see if I can pick the right window. Right here. So anyway, all these are good for discussion. And, you know, as you go further and further on, you kind of realize that nobody really has the answers yet. You know, this is new stuff. And again, my feeling is demonstration projects are really the way to go. Right. So I hate when someone scrolls the screen on me, but I'm going to do it on you guys anyway, right here too as well. But here, you know, they talk about a little stuff we did, you know, less invasive from open to notes procedure. We talked about that. And I think what's interesting here, when we go down, besides the need for autonomous robotic surgery, is this idea of levels of surgical robot autonomy, which was actually introduced in an article I was part of a little while back. But here it's kind of like self-driving cars. You know, we're dividing to no autonomy. Teleoperation at level 1 was Da Vinci, then task autonomy, supervised autonomy, high level, and full autonomy. So I don't know, maybe we'll get to supervised or high level in my lifetime. You know, you might say that CyberKnife maybe is doing some sort of task autonomy and moving, you know, the radiation beam up and down. And they give some examples here. So I think this is worth looking at. They also, Hopkins on LinkedIn now, and ARPA-H also now has a nice video of this project that I presented called SARTS, you know, the autonomous robotic resection of tumors, that gives you a little bit more. But I think it's better. Let me stop here and we use the time for discussion. And then finally, if I can put in the chat too, let me find which one is the chat. Okay. Which one is the chat? The comments box, the text box? Chat with everyone. Yeah, I am running a meeting this fall. I think, Con, we've got you signed up, or hopefully now you at least have your code to sign up right here, which is going to be local October 10th to 11th on the future of surgery. Where we'll discuss all these things. You know, we're going to have Axel's going to come, some colleagues from overseas, Dan will be there. And, you know, it's, I think it's really exciting time because you got all these technical developments going. But on the other hand, you know, trying to plan as to where you're going can be a little challenging. And then you realize you take your best plan and you iterate there. So let me stop there. I'm sorry, guys, it was such a hodgepodge of different stuff today. But just wanted to share some of my thoughts, and happy to open up the discussion now for further comments. So please go ahead and either just start talking or raise your hand.
Cool. Thank you, guys. And I want to encourage the SDSC folks to ask openly. You know, Kevin's a friend and all that. So, you know, there's no questions are off limits if you want to know, you know, anything about these things. You know, feel free, or if you have stuff you want to ask.
You can ask me about my pickleball game, which is my new sport, being a senior citizen now at 65, and I'm improving. So I may go pro soon right here too, but it probably wouldn't pay the same as my day job right here.
Yeah, it might pay better. And also, if you guys have bicycles, I want to encourage you, if anyone has a bicycle and it doesn't run well, Kevin will fix it.
Yeah, that's my other hobby. I built a bike shed out back during COVID, and I fix up bikes for the neighborhood and give them away. So, all right. So who's first? Don't be shy, as we say. All right, Andrew, you're up.
Hey, Kevin, nice to see you. Was wondering, you know, looking at the sort of the research and development and device development pipelines, how separate are the worlds of pediatric and adult?
Yeah. Again, I think Dan can comment as well, but to me, they're very separate, you know, and I think it's a couple reasons. One, of course, in pediatrics is we have babies we operate on, and we have obese kids that we operate on. So the spectrum. And then, of course, from a market standpoint, you know, the markets in pediatric are usually, in my opinion, not big enough. to support dedicated development. And, so when we first started the Institute, we went out to Intuitive Surgical because we had a urologist named Craig Peters, who was very well known in, that circle for using Da Vinci on kids. And we said, gave us a nice tour, blah, blah, blah. And then we said, hey, we'd like to partner with you to make a robot with smaller ports, smaller instrument for kids. And then they said, well, how many procedures do you do a year? And the guy said, oh, I did a lot. I must have done 20 last year. And they're used to like orthopedic surgeons at 300, and we joke. And then they said, well, thank you so much for visiting today. It was very nice to meet you. So I think, most things, Dan, I could be wrong, are hand-me-downs, and right, and you guys all train in the adult world first, right, before pediatrics.
Yeah, it's true. As surgeons and radiologists and pathologists and sort of the other subspecialties besides the medical specialties, all trained in adults. And yeah, there are very few to no pediatric cleared devices at all, much less devices that are specifically developed for pediatric applications. So I think that's, one of the size is a big challenge, but also different diseases. Kids have certain both congenital problems from birth and also acquired diseases of childhood that adults don't get. And those are typically poorly resourced, et cetera.
Yeah, so I added in the chat, but one of our tacks is if we can develop things for, the technologies we're developing. Obviously, if we develop a small device that can be used in pediatrics, that can be used for very, non-invasive surgery in adults. And obviously things like video annotation are completely, to me, portable. So there are ways, but this is a very common issue with some of our NIH proposals. First I thought it was great. I'm going to a pediatric hospital that loved me. And, from a philanthropy sometimes, but from a market size and procedure side, particularly if you go after rare diseases, it can be difficult.
So Kevin, I'm curious, you've seen a lot of different models of collaboration and different ways of working, around both engineering new devices, and then I think something like, what you're working on with the robotic assisted partial nephrectomy procedure, where there is already an industry robot, let's say, maybe unlike, let's say, shoulder pain relief, brain bot and so on. There's really not a brain bot. I mean, I can't go buy a brain bot at the shelf.
Right.
Curious how you think about, the challenges of working in that space where there's already incumbent commercial solutions and what that means for you as a developer and as an engineer, how you select problems and, how you decide to partner with, I guess the Intuitive example you gave, sometimes doesn't go the way we want, but.
Right. Well, again, when we started this institute, we had also this dream of making an industry advisory board, where we would have industry like some Hopkins actually has one, for their, and then, we just again realized that the pediatric market, unfortunately, doesn't have critical mass. And so at the end, what we did is we said, well, we're going to do projects based on clinical need. We really are a technology resource for the hospital. And, although the technology is evolving fast, we need, clinicians like yourself, Dan, to kind of tell us where the need is. And then we did start branching out. We realized that as a pediatric hospital, and even with the engineers we had, if we put a Hopkins on our team, a Georgia Tech, with all the resources they have, by partners, we do better. So I would say how we do projects is one, we still, say first clinical need. Two is, then we look at that and then we look what technology is there, and then can we find partners? So we were looking at orthopedics, again, something called PAO, percutaneous acetabular osteotomy, where they reposition the hip socket, and now we have a 3D C-arm we can bring in. And we're like, we can do some of that, but we have a guy, again, who was at Hopkins, who's an expert in 2D to 3D registration. So then you build the team. So for us, it's very project specific. And then, of course, for us at the end of the day, at first we had huge philanthropy. I didn't show the slide with the $150 million gift in 2010. By the way, we joke, we only got 50 million. We put 20 million into an endowment. So, and they used that to renovate all the ORs. But, that ran out, 5 years ago. So now we are kind of on a funding model. So at the end of the day, it really depends upon what we can get funded. But I would say clinical need, partnerships, and then, again, what can get funded, which of course is very challenging in the current environment. Now on the plus side, again, when you go to meetings, like I was at Computer Aided Radiology Surgery in Berlin, in June, followed by the Hamlin Medical Robotics in at the end of June, Imperial College London. There is an explosion of interest in this field now. This is a hot topic right here. So, I think, again, companies are putting money into it. I think most companies, like the orthopedic companies who sell implants, they seem to think they need a robot to sell their implants right here. So there's lots of robots, and again, more in space, not so much in the soft tissue space yet right here. And then, again, the technology, of the augmented, the AI, vision, video recognition, all that. I think companies are sending people to these meetings and looking to develop this. But again, finding your niche is still a little challenging.
See, I'm gonna go out of turn here and actually call on somebody, because I could inflict that on some people on this call. But I know he's usually good for it, and this is very potentially off topic. So I'd love to hear what Andrew Rama has to say.
Calling me out. Hi, Kevin. Thank you for a great presentation. One thing that came to mind, as it does with anyone who gives similar talks and shows their expertise, I'm always curious of have you run into colleagues that struggle with adapting or don't want to, and how could you convince them? And not only colleagues, but just people in the space.
Yeah. So do you mean, Andrew, colleagues on the clinical side who may not think they need this, or do you mean also on the engineering and technical side, or what? Can you clarify just a little bit?
Yeah, on the clinical side more so.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, I do feel the older surgeons, of course, are a little less receptive. They train, that's not always true, but, they train for a long time. They think their outcomes are pretty good. I think consistency is key in medicine. Although we have, Dr. Sandler, who I joke, I don't like to reveal that he's the same age as me, but he is, we're just 2 days apart. I mean, he's still going strong. And I think he's become a little bit more of a convert as he's seen some of this stuff. He's got his own caveats, about appropriate use. So, and then obviously, I think Dan is still in the younger surgeon category, we can say, they're very enthusiastic about technology and are technology enthusiasts. So, for us, we have 600 doctors at the hospital, right? Maybe more now. If I say, look, even 10% want to work with me, that's 60, 5%, that's 30 doctors. So that's still a pretty big pool. So I don't try to convince ones who aren't interested. I don't think I can make them drink the Kool-Aid. I think you have to find people who, are technology enthusiasts or who have a clinical problem they want to solve that you think you may have a solution from. But I don't think you can convert them. And as we talked about before, I don't think surgical consensus works. And I would have to say, even from a personality project, I tried to have one project, one surgical lead right here. And again, I think the younger surgeons are more cooperative that way. But of course, when you're in the OR, you're in charge, and you should be, because you're responsible for the patient. So I do try to have one surgeon lead on each project as well, and not multiple surgeon leads on projects.
Yeah, thank you for a great answer.
So sometimes, even for us, it's not easy. We say, look, we do, again, have people like Dan, we've got some of his colleagues. I have my boss, Tony Sandler, who's enthusiastic. But we have to also reach outside, so sometimes we also do reach to other people. So actually tomorrow, Dan, I forgot to tell you, I have a guy, Sohail Misra, who's coming, orthopedic surgeon, who I think was the innovation lead at Dartmouth for a long time, Dartmouth Hitchcock. And is now down here at Inova Fairfax, and is, I think forward thinking. He's visiting, so if we get a chance, we'll try to introduce him to you. But, we do look at also people who are, participating in meetings, who are kind of, also the enthusiasts for the technology. So sometimes we have to look externally for partners as well as internally, and we have to keep the faith. The other thing, these are long roads. As we said, even that one that we did for the MRI robotics that we finally got in a trial has been 5 or 6 years, and the medical pathway towards to actual clinical use is long for many reasons. So don't get, but I think if you can do it, it's again fantastic field to work in. I told him I still want to go 5 more years and retire at 70, partially because I like it, but partially because I want to see what happens with all this stuff. Are we still going to need Dan in 5 years? I think so. But where are the robots going to go, and how are robots and technology going to work together?
All right. Other questions? I know a couple of us have to drop off, but I encourage the younger folks particularly to stay and learn from Kevin for a few minutes, maybe without the older one's supervision, if that's okay. But thank you guys so much. And thank you, Kevin, for a wonderful talk and, for all the great things over the years. Thank you.